The rain found every hole in Jack's boots, and by the time his shift ended at the loading dock, his socks were soaked through and his knees ached with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He didn't complain. Complaining was a luxury for men who hadn't seen what he'd seen, buried what he'd buried. He pulled his jacket tighter and walked the 11 blocks home, because bus fare was money better spent on his daughter's dinner. Her name was Maya, 6 years old, and she was the only reason Jack Reeves still had a reason to open his eyes every morning. She was waiting at the window when he turned onto their street, breath fogging the glass in the shape of a heart she'd drawn herself. By the time he reached the door she had it open, arms thrown around his soaked legs, not caring that the rain had made him cold. "You're late," she said, the way a 6-year-old delivers an accusation that is really just relief wearing a disguise. "Traffic," Jack said, which wasn't quite a lie, since traffic was the reason he'd had to walk instead of catch the earlier bus, since he'd given his last $5 to a man outside the grocery store who hadn't eaten in 2 days. He didn't tell her that part. He never told her the parts that would make her carry weight she was too young to carry. He made dinner from what they had, less than he wanted and more than nothing, and sat across from her while she told him, in exhaustive detail, about the caterpillar her class was observing, and how her teacher said it would become a butterfly, and how she didn't believe it because caterpillars and butterflies looked nothing alike and grown-ups told kids things that weren't true all the time. "Some things are true even when they don't look like they could be," Jack told her, and something in his voice made her look up with the wide, searching eyes she'd inherited from her mother, who was no longer part of either of their lives. He smiled before the moment could go anywhere else, and changed the subject to bath time and bed, and the 3 stories she demanded every night like a toll he gladly paid. Later, alone in the dark, Jack let himself remember, for exactly as long as he allowed himself, who he used to be. Not the man who drove a forklift for a warehouse that would replace him without a second thought. The other man. The one who had spent 9 years in rooms he wasn't supposed to talk about, wearing a name that wasn't the one on Maya's birth certificate. He had buried that man on purpose, buried him under grocery lists and parent-teacher conferences, under the particular exhaustion of loving someone so much it scared him. He had told himself, leaving the service, that the only mission left worth completing was raising his daughter into a woman who never had to know what he knew about the world. Stay quiet. Stay small. Stay alive long enough to see her grow up soft in a world he had made hard on her behalf, without her ever knowing the cost. He had no idea, sitting there with a cup of coffee gone cold, that the world was about to ask him to break that promise. Across the city, in a glass tower that caught the last orange light and threw it back like a blade, Evelyn Sinclair stood at her window and watched the city she had built her empire on top of, and felt it watching her back with something like hunger. She was 38, called the coldest woman in venture capital by the financial press, and she had never corrected the description because it was useful. Cold women didn't get undercut in negotiations. She had built Sinclair Dynamics from a single logistics contract into a multinational empire over 14 relentless years, and she had done it by never letting anyone see her flinch. There was only one crack in the armor, currently doing homework at a small desk in the corner of Evelyn's office. Chloe was 7, all elbows and unbrushed hair, and Evelyn found her, against her own will, endearing. Chloe was the softest thing in Evelyn's life, and also the most dangerous, because anyone who wanted to hurt Evelyn would eventually realize the fastest way was through her daughter. She had increased security twice that year. She had fired a nanny for taking Chloe to a park unannounced. She had installed a man named Victor Cross as head of security, a broad-shouldered former corporate intelligence officer whose smile never quite reached his eyes, and she had told herself his obsequiousness was professionalism and not something else entirely. She had no way of knowing that Victor Cross had already begun selling pieces of her company's future to a rival consortium that wanted Sinclair Dynamics broken into parts they could digest one at a time, or that the professional-looking men who would try to grab her daughter 3 days later, in broad daylight outside a shopping plaza, were the opening move of that plan. She only knew, watching Chloe erase and rewrite the same math problem for the 4th time, that she loved her daughter with a ferocity that frightened her, and believed, wrongly, that money could buy enough protection to make that fear unnecessary. The plaza was crowded that Saturday, families moving between the fountain and the ice cream stand, and it was in exactly that noise that 3 men in delivery uniforms peeled from a parked van and moved toward Chloe with the calm of men who had done this before. Her nanny, distracted by her phone for 11 seconds, didn't see it happen. Chloe was looking at a display of stuffed animals when a hand closed around her arm hard enough to hurt, and a second hand covered her mouth before any sound escaped. Jack was 40 feet away, sitting on a bench with a grocery bag between his feet, waiting on Maya to choose between two nearly identical hair clips, when something in the crowd's rhythm broke. He didn't consciously register what he saw. The body knew before the mind caught up, the way they drilled into him for 9 years, and it woke instantly, the way a held breath releases. He saw the angle of a shoulder that didn't match casual movement. He saw a second man positioning himself to block sight lines to a camera. He saw a child's shoe skid across the pavement, and something in him that had slept for 6 years opened its eyes all the way. "Stay here," he told Maya, and something in his voice made her freeze mid-sentence and sit down without argument, because she had never once heard her father sound like that, flat and absolute, a door closing. He crossed 40 feet in under 4 seconds, moving the way water moves, finding the fastest path without seeming to hurry. He was on the first man before the man finished repositioning his grip, catching his wrist and turning it a direction wrists were not built to turn, redirecting the collapse headfirst into a support column with exactly enough force to end the conversation and not an ounce more, because there was a child 18 inches away. The second man reached for something at his waistband. Jack closed the distance first, caught the wrist, drove an elbow into the throat with a controlled economy that looked, to panicked onlookers, less like violence and more like choreography. The third man made the mistake of running toward the fight instead of away from it, and Jack met him with a single strike to the solar plexus that folded him to the ground gasping. 11 seconds, start to finish, and Chloe was standing there, released, shaking. "Are you hurt?" Jack asked, crouching, his voice soft now, the one he used with Maya. Chloe shook her head, tears finally arriving now that the danger had passed. "You're safe," Jack said. "None of this is because of anything you did." He heard sirens somewhere distant, heard the crowd's noise rising into phones held up and a woman's scream he recognized as the nanny's. He had a daughter waiting on a bench who did not need her father's face on the news standing over 3 unconscious men. "My name is Chloe," the girl said, wiping her face, trying to hold herself together the way she'd clearly been taught to, even now. "That's a good name," Jack said, and reached into his cargo pocket without thinking, pressing something small into her palm, a strip of paracord he'd braided years ago and never managed to throw away. "Hold on to that. It'll remind you that you're stronger than you think." Then he was gone, moving back through the crowd toward Maya, scooping up his grocery bag in his daughter's hand in the same motion, and by the time the first security guard arrived, Jack Reeves was 3 blocks away, walking home in rain that had started again, his heart hammering with an adrenaline he hadn't felt in 6 years and did not welcome back. Evelyn arrived 11 minutes later, having broken every traffic law in the city, and found her daughter wrapped in a police blanket, being asked questions by an officer who kept glancing nervously at his notepad. "He was fast," Chloe kept saying. "He moved so fast. And then he was just gone." "Who, sweetheart?" Evelyn asked, on her knees, hands on her daughter's face, checking for injuries with the frantic thoroughness of a mother who had almost lost the only thing that made her human. "My guardian angel," Chloe said, with the absolute conviction of a child who would not be talked out of it, and opened her fist to show the strip of paracord resting in her palm. The paracord went into an evidence bag, then to a private investigator named Dorsey, who examined the braid pattern and told her, with the tone of a man delivering information he didn't fully understand, that the knotwork was a style taught almost exclusively in special operations training, and that whoever left it had either that training or had gone to significant trouble to fake it, which seemed unlikely given how the man had moved on the 11 seconds of grainy footage recovered from a nearby camera. Evelyn watched that footage more times than she would admit. A man in a worn jacket, face angled away from every lens as though he'd mapped their positions before he moved, dismantling 3 trained abductors with the speed and precision of a demolition. Then gone, folded back into the crowd as though he'd never been there. She told herself she would find him. She did not yet understand she would find him first through her own carelessness, in her own lobby, 3 days later, in a moment she would spend the rest of her life regretting. The medical bill arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of envelope Jack had learned to recognize by weight alone. Maya's fall from the jungle gym the previous month, the cast and the follow-up scan, had cost more than 4 months of his warehouse salary combined. He had insurance through his employer. Insurance, it turned out, meant less than he'd believed. He did the math 3 times at the kitchen table after Maya was asleep, and it came out the same each time, a number with too many zeros and not enough honest time to earn them. An old contact from the Navy's transition program mentioned, almost in passing, that a downtown high-rise was hiring emergency contract labor for a week, an electrical upgrade, fast-paying, no long interview. Jack asked which building. His friend told him. Jack didn't recognize the name Sinclair Dynamics as anything but a logo on delivery trucks, and he took the job because the money was the money he needed and there was no version of pride that outweighed the sound Maya made when the cast came off. He showed up Thursday in his work clothes, tools slung over his shoulder, and walked into a marble lobby so bright and cold it felt like a hospital built by someone with better taste than compassion. The security guard who badged him and gave him the look guards in buildings like that always gave men dressed like Jack, a look less like suspicion than simple erasure. He was halfway across the lobby, reading his work order, when Evelyn Sinclair came through the revolving door at the exact wrong moment, moving fast, phone against her ear, flanked by 2 assistants and Victor Cross, all walking with the urgency of people whose time was worth more per minute than most people's per week. Jack didn't see her coming. The collision was minor, a shoulder catching a shoulder, papers scattering, nothing that would have mattered between ordinary people. But Evelyn hadn't slept properly in 3 days, had replayed 11 seconds of footage on a loop, had a board meeting in 9 minutes where 2 directors were preparing to question her judgment over a security failure that nearly cost her daughter's safety, and she turned on Jack with all of that pressure and none of it aimed at the right target. "Watch where you're going," she snapped, ice in it, real ice, from somewhere deeper than the moment warranted. She looked him up and down, the worn jacket, the scuffed boots, the toolbox. "Is this what passes for vetting now? Who let you in here looking like this?" "My apologies," Jack said, quiet, already crouching to gather his papers, already deciding, the way he'd decided 1,000 times, that this moment wasn't worth the version of himself it would cost to correct her. Victor Cross, sensing an opportunity to perform loyalty, stepped forward with a smile that had nothing kind in it. "This is a secure facility, not a homeless shelter," he said, loud enough that heads turned, loud enough that the desk guard laughed once before catching himself. "Whoever cleared this man for building access is getting an uncomfortable phone call this afternoon." "I have a work order," Jack said, still crouched, still level, the kind of level most people mistook for submission. "I'm sure you do," Evelyn said, already turning toward the elevators, the confrontation already erased by the 9 minutes left before her meeting. "Just do whatever you're here to do and try not to touch anything you shouldn't." Jack stood, papers reassembled, and watched her go, felt the old heat rise and made the same choice he always made, breathed it down into the place where he kept everything that didn't serve Maya, and walked to the service elevator without another word. He spent the next 3 days largely invisible, the way skilled tradesmen in glass towers usually are, moving through service corridors and electrical rooms, the spaces behind walls no one who worked in the offices ever thought about. He learned the building methodically, without being told to, because knowing his environment completely wasn't a skill he could turn off even for a fire suppression relay. On the 3rd day, Chloe saw him. She had wandered to the vending machine on 14 with her mother's assistant's permission, and stopped dead at the sight of a man in a maintenance uniform crouched over an open panel, humming something she almost recognized as a lullaby. She knew his eyes before she understood why. She knew the shape of his hands, the same stillness that had cut through 3 grown men in 11 seconds outside a shopping plaza. "It's you," she said, and Jack looked up, and for a half-second something in his face went carefully blank, the old training reasserting itself, deny, deflect, disappear, and then he looked at her, really looked, and something in him softened despite every instinct telling him not to. "I think you have me confused with someone else," he said gently, the closest thing to a lie he could manage while looking at a child he'd saved. "You gave me this," Chloe said, producing the paracord from her jacket pocket, worn now from 3 days of anxious hands turning it over. "I kept it every day. My mom doesn't know I still have it, because the police wanted it, but I kept a piece." "You should get back to the office," Jack said, quiet, careful. "Someone will worry." "Are you going to disappear again?" Chloe asked, something almost accusatory in it, a 7-year-old's grief at nearly losing a hero she'd only just found. I have work to finish, Jack said, which wasn't an answer, and they both knew it, and Chloe nodded slowly and walked back toward the elevator, and Jack watched her go and felt, for the first time in 3 days, genuinely afraid, not of discovery, but of what discovery might cost the fragile peace he'd built around Maya's life. Chloe told her mother that evening, in the car, with the bluntness only children manage, that the maintenance man on 14 was her guardian angel. Evelyn, exhausted, told her daughter that guardian angels didn't fix electrical panels for a living, and Chloe insisted, describing his eyes, his hands, the way he moved, until something in the specificity of it stopped sounding like fantasy and started sounding, to a mother who'd spent 3 sleepless nights staring at grainy footage, like something worth checking. Evelyn pulled the contractor roster the next morning and found Jack Reeves listed as emergency electrical labor, hired through a staffing agency, no photograph, no notable history beyond a license number and an address in a part of the city she'd never had reason to visit. She told herself it was probably nothing, and walked to 14 anyway, alone, without Victor, without an assistant, and found Jack coiling a length of cable with the unhurried competence of a man who had done manual labor his whole life, or trained his body to look like he had. Mr. Reeves, she said, and watched him go very still. He turned, and up close, without the noise of the lobby collision, Evelyn saw his eyes for the first time, and something in her chest performed a slow, sickening drop, because she recognized them from 3 days of her daughter's descriptions, dark and steady and completely without malice even after the way she'd spoken to him. My daughter thinks you're the man who saved her at the plaza, Evelyn said, hanging somewhere between fear and hope, because if it was true, the man she'd humiliated in her own lobby was the same man who'd put himself between professional abductors and her only child. Jack could have denied it. He'd denied it to Chloe. But he was tired, and the bill on his kitchen table had a number he couldn't erase by pretending to be smaller than he was, and something about the raw fear in Evelyn's face made the lie feel unworthy of him. Your daughter is a very observant young lady, he said, as close to a confession as he intended to offer. Evelyn's hand went to her mouth. Why didn't you say something? In the lobby, when I spoke to you the way I did. Would it have mattered? Jack asked, not cruelly, just honestly, and Evelyn had no answer, understanding in the silence that it wouldn't have, that she had looked at a man in worn clothes and decided everything about him in 4 seconds. I want to thank you properly, she said. Come to my office. Please. In her office, with Chloe pretending not to listen at her small desk in the corner, Evelyn slid a folded check across the desk, a number with enough zeros to erase every bill Jack had ever worried about. This isn't enough, she said. Nothing would be. But it's what I can offer. Jack looked at it without touching it. He thought about the hospital bill, about how easy it would be, how practical, how nobody would blame him. Then he thought about the word she'd used in the lobby, homeless shelter, about the guard who'd laughed, about being seen as a problem to pay off rather than a person to respect, and something in him, quiet and immovable, refused. I don't want your money, he said, sliding the check back. I did what needed doing. That's not for sale. Then what do you want? The wage I earned this week for the work I actually did. Nothing else. Evelyn stared at him, and something in the calculations that had governed every relationship in her adult life quietly failed to produce an answer. You saved my daughter's life and you want a maintenance wage. I saved a child's life, Jack said. Whose daughter she was didn't factor into it. He left without the check, and Evelyn sat alone afterward, staring at the folded paper, and it was in that unsettled silence that her curiosity, sharpened now by something closer to shame, turned into an instruction to Dorsey that would open a door she wasn't prepared to walk through. He called 2 days later, a note of professional confusion in his voice. I can't get a clean file on this man. Standard check comes back thin, and when I tried his service record through my usual channel, it came back redacted. Not missing. Redacted. That's a file somebody decided to seal. Evelyn sat with that a long time, looking out at the city, and began, for the first time, to be genuinely afraid of what she had almost missed. She had no idea that evening that Victor Cross had already scheduled the operation that would prove her fear correct. Victor had spent the better part of a year cultivating a relationship with a rival consortium that had twice failed to acquire Sinclair Dynamics through legitimate channels, and had finally arrived at an arrangement uglier and more direct than any boardroom could produce. He would deliver Evelyn Sinclair, isolated and afraid, to a table she couldn't walk away from, in exchange for a controlling stake in whatever remained once the company was dismantled and redistributed among men who'd never built anything and were comfortable taking apart what others had. He chose a Friday evening, when the building emptied and Evelyn habitually stayed late, when Chloe, inconveniently but not fatally, would be there too, a complication Victor decided was actually useful, since a mother with her daughter in danger signed whatever was placed in front of her. At 6:40, every phone line in the tower went dead simultaneously. The communications infrastructure Victor had spent weeks quietly compromising folded into total blackout, cell signals jammed, elevators locked into a security override that trapped every floor's occupants in place. 12 armed men in tactical gear, smuggled in over the previous 2 hours through a service entrance Victor controlled, began moving methodically upward toward the executive suite on 52. Evelyn heard the first alarm, a low mechanical wail she'd never heard before, the building's dedicated lockdown protocol, and was already moving toward Chloe's desk when Victor walked into her office with 4 armed men behind him and the expression of a man who had been planning this for a long time. "I'll need your signature on a few documents," he said, and Chloe, 7 and suddenly understanding with total clarity that the safest room in her life had become the most dangerous, reached for her mother's hand. 14 floors below, in an electrical room that smelled of ozone and dust, Jack was finishing his contract when the lights flickered in a pattern his body recognized before his conscious mind caught up, a controlled brownout, not a malfunction. He listened through the walls separating the room from a security substation and heard, on an active radio someone had left on a table, the crackle of tactical shorthand, floor numbers, sweep patterns, the vocabulary of men who had trained together recently. He heard a voice confirm that the package was secured on 52, a word that made something in his chest go cold and precise, and another voice mention, almost as an aside, a little girl who wouldn't stop crying. Jack set the radio down and stood still for exactly 3 seconds, the last 3 seconds in which he was only a tired father with a hospital bill and worn boots, and then something older and more absolute rose up and took the wheel, and he began moving through the building with the calm, methodical purpose of a man returning to the only version of himself capable of doing what needed to be done. He knew the building's service architecture better than any of the 12 men now sweeping its floors, because he'd spent 3 days learning every vent, every stairwell, every blind spot in the camera coverage. He climbed the stairwell rather than trust the elevator, and along the way assembled, from what a working electrician's cart naturally contained, a set of tools that were not weapons and were, in his hands, entirely capable of becoming exactly that. A length of insulated cable. A reinforced flashlight. A can of aerosol contact cleaner that, sprayed and lit, produced a brief disorienting flash. A screwdriver he'd sharpened, out of habit, months ago, for no reason he could have named at the time. He found the first patrol on 18, 2 men moving through an empty conference space with the loose confidence of soldiers who believed themselves the only professionals in the building. Jack watched from a supply closet for 11 seconds, long enough to read their spacing, their rhythm, the small tell on the lead man's shoulder that meant he checked his corners a half-second slower than his partner, and then he moved. The fight lasted under a minute and produced almost no sound, and he left both men zip-tied with their own restraints, radios confiscated, and before moving on he keyed the surviving radio. "You have men on 18 who are no longer available," he said, voice level. "I'd recommend reconsidering your evening." The silence that followed on the other end told Victor Cross, more than any threat could have, that whoever was speaking wasn't bluffing, and something in his carefully constructed calm cracked for the first time. Up on 52, Evelyn heard the radio chatter grow tighter, watched Victor's composure fray floor by floor as reports came in of teams going silent, and thought of the redacted file, the 11 seconds of footage, a man who'd refused a check with more money in it than most people saw in a lifetime, and something in her chest, against every rational instinct, began to hope. "No one is coming for you," Victor said, more to himself than to her, an assurance he no longer believed, and Evelyn understood with sudden clarity that he was wrong. Jack moved floor by floor, ending resistance quickly and without unnecessary violence, disarming rather than harming wherever the choice existed, because some part of him remembered he had a daughter waiting at home. But the closer he came to 52, the more the men had clearly been briefed to expect him, and by the 48th floor he was bleeding from a cut along his forearm, breathing harder than he wanted to admit, 6 years of civilian softness reasserting a cost his body hadn't paid in a long time. He kept moving anyway. He reached the executive floor's service entrance at 7:50, guarded by 3 men positioned for trouble, and used the aerosol and a spark from his screwdriver to produce a flash and a concussive pop loud enough to disorient without permanent harm, and in the 2 seconds of confusion moved through all 3 men with a speed that looked, to anyone watching, closer to a magic trick than a fight. He came through into the outer office, and Victor, having listened to his men fall silent floor by floor for 40 minutes, finally understood the man he'd mocked in the lobby wasn't going to stop, and reached for the nearest leverage, which was Chloe, small and frightened, still holding her mother's hand. "Take another step and I break her arm," Victor said, his voice cracking on the word arm, the first honest fear he'd shown all evening. Jack stopped, not because the threat worked as intended, but because he'd learned long ago that the correct response to a desperate man holding a child was patience wearing the mask of surrender. "You don't want to do that," Jack said, hands loosely open, every muscle coiled and still. "Not because I'll stop you. Because you'll have to live with it, and men like you don't have the stomach for that. You've been giving orders all night. You haven't done anything yourself." Victor's grip tightened, and Chloe, remembering the paracord in her pocket, remembering a man who told her she was stronger than she thought, went suddenly limp in a way that loosened his grip for exactly the half-second Jack needed. He crossed the room with a speed that made Evelyn feel time itself had briefly stopped working, separated Victor from Chloe with a single controlled motion that put the girl safely into her mother's arms and put Victor on the floor, his weapon no longer within his reach. The fight that followed was brutal and brief, Victor throwing everything he had into a confrontation he'd never trained for, relying on size and desperation against a man trained for exactly this, and it ended with Victor face down on the marble, restrained with his own zip ties, all the fight gone out of him. Police arrived within the hour, and the tower filled with radios and boots and the particular chaos that follows violence once it's finished. Evelyn sat on the floor of her office with Chloe wrapped in her arms, both shaking, and watched Jack answer questions from officers who had no framework for a maintenance contractor who had single-handedly ended a 12-man operation, and understood, watching him, that she had spent a week looking at the most extraordinary person she'd ever met and seeing only his clothes. She found him afterward in the lobby, waiting to be released, and walked up without any of the armor she usually wore into every room. "I'm sorry," she said. "For the lobby. For the check. For every assumption I made about you before I bothered to know a single true thing." Her voice caught. "You saved my daughter twice. And both times I treated you like you owed me an explanation for existing." Jack looked at her for a long moment, thought about 6 years of swallowed pride, about a hospital bill still on his kitchen table, about a daughter waiting at home who had no idea her father had spent the evening becoming, briefly and completely, the man he'd buried for her sake. "You were afraid," he said. "Fear makes people ugly sometimes. Doesn't excuse it. But I understand it better than most." "I want to make this right," Evelyn said. "Not with a check. I'm offering you a position, head of security, full authority, full compensation, and equity in the company, because I trust you with the 2 things that matter most to me, and I've never said that about another person outside my own daughter." Jack thought about it, not out of hesitation about his own pride, that battle had already been fought and settled, but out of the calculation every decision now ran through, what does this mean for Maya, and found an answer that let him say yes without reservation. A stable income. A future that didn't depend on a warehouse schedule. A world where his daughter would never again watch him walk 11 blocks home in the rain because bus fare was money better spent on her dinner. "I'll take the position," Jack said. "Not the equity. The position, and the wage that comes with actually doing the job. That's all I need." Evelyn almost argued, then caught herself, remembering the check, remembering what he'd told her about things that weren't for sale, and instead simply nodded, and extended her hand, and Jack shook it, and something settled between them that wasn't quite friendship yet but was, unmistakably, respect, earned the hard way, the only way either of them had ever trusted. Chloe found him before he left, breaking free of her mother's grip to throw her arms around his waist the way she'd wanted to since the moment in the plaza when he vanished before she could thank him properly. "I told my mom you were my guardian angel," she said. "She didn't believe me. I believe you now, Evelyn said quietly, meaning it in a way that went deeper than the word suggested. A woman who had spent her whole life believing strength wore expensive suits and had finally learned, in one impossible evening, that it sometimes wore worn boots and said nothing about itself at all. Jack walked home that night instead of taking the car service Evelyn offered, needing the 11 blocks of quiet to fold himself back into the man Maya was waiting for, and when he climbed the stairs and opened the door, she was there at the window as always, already running to him before it had finished opening, and he knelt down and held her the way he had held her every night of her life, and felt, for the first time in 6 years, that he no longer had to choose between the man he used to be and the father he had become. 3 weeks later, Jack started his new position, arriving each morning to a lobby where the same guard who had once erased him with a glance now greeted him by name, and he built, floor by floor, the kind of security a family like Evelyn's had needed all along, not walls of money, but the quiet, competent presence of a man who understood exactly what it cost to protect the people who mattered. Chloe visited his office often, doing her homework at a small desk he kept for exactly that purpose, and sometimes Maya came too, the two girls quickly discovering they had more in common than either had expected. Evelyn, watching them from her own office one afternoon, thought about how far the distance had traveled between a cold command in a marble lobby and this, two children laughing over homework while their parents built something neither of them had words for yet, and understood, finally, that the wealth she had spent her life accumulating had never once been the thing keeping her family safe. It had always been the quiet, unassuming man in worn boots, who had walked 11 blocks in the rain rather than spend $1 he didn't have, who had given up everything he used to be for the sake of a little girl waiting at a window, and who had, when the world demanded it of him one more time, remembered exactly who he was, and chosen, without hesitation, to become that man again for the sake of another little girl who needed him just as much.